When Leopold realised how musical his children were, he decided to take them on a tour of Europe. Wolfgang was just 7 years old. There was a lot of travelling. In fact, they travelled for 4 whole years. First, Leopold took Wolfgang and Nannerl to Munich, where they both performed concerts. And then concerts in Frankfurt, Bonn, Cologne and Brussels. Then it was on to Paris for more concerts. And then across the English Channel to London for even more concerts. The crossing was no fun at all, and they were all seasick. Then they turned around and went back across the English Channel and travelled to Amsterdam for, yes, that's right, more concerts. Then it was back on the road again, this time to Munich, where their concert tour had started out. Finally, in 1766, the family returned home to Salzburg. By now, Wolfgang was a star. He had played in front of most of the important people in each of the countries he'd visited, including kings and queens. Throughout his life, Wolfgang kept in touch with his family by writing letters. In those days, there were no mobile phones or emails, so the only way to let everyone back home in Salzburg know his news was to write to them in ink. He was a particularly keen letter writer, and it is possible to see how he was feeling by reading his letters. Sometimes he was happy and excited, and sometimes he was sad and frustrated. Often, when he wrote to his sister Nannerl, he would finish his letters by telling her to kiss Mama's hands for me 10 million times. The young Wolfgang could do all sorts of tricks while sitting at the piano keyboard. One of his favourites was to play with his hands hidden underneath a cloth so that he couldn't see any of the notes. The audiences always loved it. Wolfgang didn't just excel at performing, though. By the time he'd reached the age of 12, he'd already completed 2 operas. In December 1769, he set off on yet another journey. This time it was to Italy. While he was there, he heard a truly beautiful piece of music called the Miserere. It was sung by a choir and written by a famous composer called Gregorio Allegri, who lived in Rome more than a century before Wolfgang was born. The music made such an impression on Wolfgang that he rushed off back to his room and quickly wrote it down. Every single note was perfect. Nothing was out of place. He heard Allegri's Miserere just twice and remembered all 11 minutes of the piece. So, to add to all his other talents, Wolfgang also had an incredible memory. He was still writing his own music, of course, and everyone who heard it was amazed. Another famous composer called Joseph Haydn said to Wolfgang's father Leopold,
"I must tell you before God and as an honest man that your son is the greatest composer I ever heard of."
From the age of 13, Mozart began working on and off for the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg. Eventually, he annoyed his boss so much that he was sacked from his job. The Prince Archbishop's secretary actually kicked him on the bottom as Mozart left for the final time. They seemed quite pleased to be rid of poor old Wolfgang, but he wasn't put off. In 1781, when he was just 25, he moved to Vienna. In the same year, he was challenged to a duel by another composer and talented pianist called Muzio Clementi. But don't worry, though, this wasn't a duel involving swords or pistols. This was a musical duel. Each man would try to outplay the other on the piano. Clementi played... and Mozart played. In the end, the judges decided that Clementi and Mozart were both as good as each other. They declared it a draw, and everyone went home happy. Everyone, that is, except Mozart, who was convinced that he was a better pianist than his rival. He was probably right, but it would have been better manners to have agreed with the judges. Mozart could often be quite big-headed, and this must have made it difficult for other people to get on with him. He was very good at upsetting people and at making enemies. But it must have been very hard for him to live his life, being told that he was the best from a very young age. He did, however, remain friends with Joseph Haydn throughout his life. Once Mozart challenged Haydn to play a piece of music that he'd written. Haydn sat at the keyboard and played, but stopped suddenly. He told his friend that it was impossible for one person with just 2 hands to reach all of the notes on the keyboard at the same time. Mozart took his place at the keyboard and proved Haydn wrong. When it got to the difficult bit, he played with his left hand, and with his right hand, and also with his nose. He used it to hit the notes that he wouldn't have otherwise been able to reach. Mozart was always full of energy and ideas, and would spend as much time as possible sitting at the keyboard composing new music. He wasn't very good at keeping still. It used to drive his barber mad, because often in the middle of having his hair done, Mozart would suddenly jump up from the seat and charge over to the keyboard because he'd had an idea about a new piece of music. The poor old barber would have to chase after him and finish off the job while his customer sat at the piano. Mozart fell in love with a young lady called Aloysia Weber, but she wasn't interested in going out with him. Again, he didn't let this get him down, and he went out with her younger sister, Constanza, instead. A few years later, in 1782, they were married and had children of their own.